All right, folks, welcome back. We're at the end of the book, Cultural Studies, 1983. This is the final lecture from the book. I hope you've enjoyed the book as a whole, but I really got a lot out of this last lecture. Hopefully, you did too. Anyway, let's jump into it. So, I think this is probably the crux of this chapter, and really the book as a whole, right? He's talked about how these more traditional Marxists tended to fixate on the means of production, the economy, and he says repeatedly throughout this chapter that we can't reduce culture to just those other areas, right? It's sort of a thing that needs to be looked at on its own, not just in relation to politics or to the economy, right? And he says it's got its own specificity to it, its own modality. It's relatively autonomous or independent from those other levels. He says culture is not and can never be outside of the structuring field of the central contradictions that give shape, pattern, and configuration to a social formation. That is, contradictions around class, but also ethnicity and gender. So we're going far beyond, again, class issues here, looking at racism in society, sexism, youth culture, youth subcultures, all kinds of stuff that I guess a more traditional hardline Marxists would want to dismiss as really irrelevant, right? And so he's saying all this other stuff is outside of these other areas of determination, but they're not reducible to it. So you can't just say, well, for example, gender issues. You can't just say, well, that really all boils down to the economy and the distribution of wealth in a society. And if you do something like that, if you say really it's all just economic issues, then you're reducing it in Hall's opinion, and that's not the way to go. On the other hand, it's not that class, whether you're part of the capitalist class or a worker or maybe outside of the system altogether. So that he's not saying it has no impact. It's just that it's not determined by that class. So that seems pretty straightforward to me. Then he talks a little bit more about ideologies and how they form. He talks about these critical historical moments when ideologies are forming. And he says the point that you want to pay attention to is where a class or a fraction of a class engages a particular system of representations to understand its emerging place in the world, to define what those relations are and how they are different from those of the previous epoch. And so he says this is the only way they can make sense of and normalize the emerging values and forms of collective action. And again, he says again this idea that you can't just go in there and pick out one of these little elements of an ideology, because inevitably you sort of stumble into all this other stuff, all these other chains of connotations that just go on and on forever, kind of maybe rhizomatically. So he's going to get some examples in this chapter, some different movements. He talks about Rastafarians in here. He talks about the rise of liberal democracies. There's all kinds of examples to show what he's talking about here. But I'll come back to this idea. Yeah, this is the part that I wanted to focus on here on page 182. So he's talking still about ideology, and he says an ideology may be articulated for a particular class. So this could have, he talks about the bourgeoisie or the people who own the means of production, the 1% or the rich people or whatever. So if you look at, say, I was thinking a lot about the American Revolution, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, all these documents, and he gives examples too, right, about how you might say "we the people" was part of that document. Let's just take that as our example. We the people hold these inalienable rights and so on and so forth. But when were putting that together back in the 1770s, they weren't thinking, even though it said the people, they didn't include women and slaves as being people, right? That was not part of the original plan. But by using that phrase, the people, it opened the possibility for those people who had been excluded from that definition. And that's kind of what happened historically, right? Later on. So I think that's the interesting idea to me is that you can have this ideology that maybe only is intended to benefit this one sector, but it seems almost inevitably it leaves some room, it leaves a little gap that other groups that are excluded at the time can take advantage of later on. So he talks about all these radical elements. So there were, of course, people back even in those times, if you look at the history, that were saying, yeah, well, we need to get rid of slavery. Everybody needs to have the right to vote, not just propertied classes. So it wasn't like those radical elements weren't there. It's just they needed to be re-articulated. So more radical elements may be articulated or stitched into place within an ideology. And then he talks a lot in here. I think the idea that he wants to avoid is if you want to reform, if you want to be a political activist, if you want change in society, what you don't want to do is just come along and say, well, let's just delete everything. Let's start from scratch. Quit practicing your religion. Quit doing this. We need something totally new. And I think for Hall, that's a pretty dumb approach. He comes back to this a couple of times in here. He says, "What really you don't want to just throw out all of this language of rights, human rights. Instead, it might be really important to latch onto those terms. You just need to re-articulate them." So he talks later. He says that we need to avoid the position that leaves the field of potential ideological intervention as an empty space. We can't ignore the endless possibilities for struggling with and contesting the dominant definitions of ideological terms in order to disarticulate them from their current class positions and re-articulate them in some ways. So he gives some examples. He talks about the word black, what that means. I think he's also talked about here the human rights and so on. I was thinking of marriage, gay marriage, and sort of how you can see this sort of dominant definition of what marriage means gets contested, right? It becomes a site of struggle. That I think really we're still kind of seeing this playing out in our political situation today. It's not that, and I've heard people say this that were advocates of gay rights say things like, well, why are we even talking about marriage? That's a kind of an old-fashioned concept anyway. Why do we even need to be talking about marriage? Let's just get rid of it completely. I think that's kind of what Hall has in mind, what he's warning against, right? Saying you don't want to take something that is so kind of fundamental and just try to dispose of it, but instead re-articulate it or disarticulate it from one position and then re-articulate it in another. So, Hall doesn't specifically use that example, but to me, it kind of makes sense. That example kind of helped me make sense of what Hall is getting at, I think. So, yeah, he must have been facing a lot of criticism about from the old school Marxist and class being the end all and be all, because he comes back again and again at this point, right? So he says, look, you can see all these periods of history where the country might have moved from a feudal system into a capitalist system. But nevertheless, when that happens, it's not universal. A country could move from an old style serfdom or whatever economy into a capitalist mode. And you see all kinds of different ways that can play out. A lot of domination might continue. Racism can continue, sexism, but also even the classes might not work out according to the model. And so he talks here again about the different struggles taking place. Sometimes one might take a leading position, but there's always so many different fronts going on. So race can't be reduced to a class issue because each appropriation is different. he gives us some very helpful examples there from his own experience, and he talks about Jamaica in here, right? And I like this line on page 186 kind of clarified things for me. It was a good example, I think. He says, look, even if black and white labor in South Africa is exploited by capital, so even if the working class, it doesn't matter if you're white or you're black, if you're a worker, if you're part of the working class and you're being exploited by the capitalist class, well, be that as it may, they're not exploited in the exact same way. So that seems to be pretty obvious to me. You can't just say, well, it doesn't matter. They're both, what's important is they're both part of the working class. We could ignore race. I think Hall is saying, no, you can't do that at all, because it's still a major factor. If you really look at the situation, you're seeing a different kind of exploitation. So I really appreciated that. That helped me to understand Hall a lot better. And then he talks about cultural forms and practices always being contradictory. So I guess every sort of form and practice has its oppositional element kind of built into it. That's just kind of obvious, right? There's no permanent classes, no permanent forms. And you can think, he uses the example of the working class and how even within this working class solidarity, let's say, they might be solid on one level, but on another level, maybe they're still, he says here, maintaining a particular form of masculinity. And so what's the, there's a word that's not coming to mind, masculine hegemony? Kind of blanking on the term, right? But you could talk about, well, we're all here, we're all on the same team, and we all need to work together. And at the same time, the so-called team is still practicing within itself all these various forms of discrimination, even within itself. There, so they might be on the same team in one sense, but on another sense, there's all this other stuff that's always going on. I don't get the sense from Hall that we can ever get to this utopian situation, that this is kind of a fact of life, I suppose. So it says, one cannot ignore the negative side in defending the positive contributions it advances, but also one cannot ignore the gains that are made while condemning its defeats. So I was thinking about this, and again, it's hard, I know, not to just apply everything he's saying to our contemporary political situation, but you see this everywhere, right? These sort of temporary coalitions of people coming together, and sometimes it's bizarre, the people that can end up in the same party or on the same side of the fence, as it were. And I think what Hall is saying here is that, yes, of course, some of the things are unfortunate, very unfortunate, perhaps. But you don't want to just say, well, we can't work with them, or again, coming back to this idea of we need a clean slate, because that's really just not how politics works. It's kind of the sense I get from Hall. But what you really want to be doing is becoming involved, he says, in the process of strengthening and deepening the oppositional elements of already existing cultural forms, and not of inviting people to abandon the forms in which they are involved and to suddenly move over to a different place into a different formation. So again, he's heavily criticizing this idea that, as a good Marxist, as someone who's read all of Karl Marx and Engels, and we're enlightened now, and we can look out there and we can see all of these very deluded people who have been brainwashed and they're suffering under false consciousness, and really we just need to sort of eliminate everything they know is wrong, and they just need to start over, and we're here to teach them. And so I think Hall couldn't get further away from that position. So that's completely not the way to go about it according to Hall. Instead, you want to find if you have a cultural form in place, and of course there always is, look at it, see if you can find where the oppositional elements are within that. See if you can strengthen and deepen those oppositional elements within this cultural form that you don't like. That's the way, to see change. Again, not to try to start over. So anyway, I think this would be a good point to pause here. I see some rhetorical implications here. If you think about what rhetoric is about, and using this understanding of culture rhetorically, I can see some potential here for that. But anyway, just what do you think so far of these lines here on 188 and 189? Do you like this idea of sort of working with an existing cultural form? Or do you think there might actually be that Hall might be wrong about this, and maybe it is better just to try to abandon those forms and just suddenly move over to a different place? I mean, who knows? I just want to see what you think about that. Okay, so moving on. He has a line here on page 190 I thought was worth ruminating on a bit. He says, cultural politics and ideological struggle are the necessary conditions for forms of social and political struggle. And so try to wrap your head around this. So, but to even have social and political struggle, before you can even get to that, you have to have cultural politics and ideological struggle. So I think that's kind of an interesting chicken and egg, or horse and cart thought here. So I guess according to Hall, if you don't have the stuff going on culturally, if you don't have this ideological struggle he's been talking about, then you're not going to get to the social and political change that you want. I guess you could agree or disagree with that. Then he talks more, and I really like this part where he talks about the residual elements and the emerging elements. So again, it's not that stuff is suddenly everything needs to be new. In fact, he says in here that really it's almost kind of erroneous to think about these things. I think, to me, I kind of imagine more of a cyclical process or a feedback loop. So he talks about how he gives the example of art and the avant-garde movements in art. And, sure, they're radically new. It's unlike anything you've seen before. But eventually I guess the novelty wears off. And he says they rapidly immigrate to the arts review pages, where they become, if not part of the dominant tradition, certainly no longer part of a strongly resistant cultural formation. Hegemony entails, before I get to that, again, I think I might have used this example before, but I'm always thinking about music. I know a lot of you are music fans as well. But, how many times have you seen this? You have a movement. He actually talks about ska in here a little in this chapter. I thought was pretty cool. But you could think about something like punk music and sort of punk subculture. And Dick Hebdige talks about this in his work. At first, this is almost as a radical thing. It's kind of dangerous. These punks with their this weird music and their hairstyles, and it really seems to be really rebellious, almost dangerous. But then, then you start to see that the fashions kind of become almost mainstream or kind of acceptable suddenly, and then you can you go to a hairstylist, a salon, and actually get the mohawk if you like. You can go to a place like Spencer's or Hot Topic and get the clothes, and you can really see in these examples how pretty soon what was so radical is actually almost cliche now, right? And it's almost a conformist wearing this stuff, whereas at one time it was this really avant-garde kind of situation. So, and then again with the art, these art movements that were so scandalous. Now you see them in the art history textbook, and they're just in there with all this other art, and it really just doesn't seem, dangerous at all at that point, right? So I think Hall is right. We just see this time and time again. It's everywhere. I don't know if you could have a movement that this didn't eventually happen to, right? And that's the way he says hegemony works. So hegemony entails, he says here on 191. Precisely this capacity to continually command a central position within an apparently open plurality of voices. So this, I guess, is when hegemony is working well. You seem to have, oh, I don't know, maybe Hall would even put that seam on there. He said maybe you have a plurality of voices, many different voices, and that's when hegemony is working. Actually, when hegemony is breaking down, you can see that situation because there is suddenly all the censorship going on, repression going on. Really, those are the points, and it's really important, I think, to pause here and think about this. So, I think most people would assume that if you have a culture where there's strong censorship, strong repression, that's hegemony. That's hegemony in full force. Whereas Hall is actually saying the opposite of that. So those are the societies where there's, hegemony is being broken, or it's sort of vulnerable, at its most vulnerable, probably about to fall apart. Whereas it's precisely when it seems to be more tolerant, more accepting, and there seemed to be more of this plurality, that's when it's actually working well. And so I thought this was really just fascinating to think about this. You also, if you want to, one of my favorite movies is a movie called Quadrophenia by the Who. You probably know that band. They did Tommy. It's called Tommy, right? With the pinball wizard and all this stuff. But really, if you watch Quadrophenia, you get to see the mods and rockers. And, it's a pretty good introduction. I don't know if we've really had anything like this in the U.S. But anyway, I just recommend the movie if you want to learn more about them. It's pretty interesting. And it's also a great album, but anyway, I digress. So anyway, we're over here on page 192. And he's talking about this generational contradiction. And, obviously, you've always got what is it now? The millennials everybody's talking about. So you're Generation X, or you're the baby boomers or whatever. And, here comes the millennials. And everybody's quick to say that, millennials this and millennials that or whatever. But I think that Hall would say this. Of course, there's going to be contradictions anytime there's this generation gap. But he says it's really important to pay attention to it. And he gives some examples. I'm not not really familiar with this skinheads movement in Britain. I was trying to maybe you could help with this if you know anything about this. I'm not sure if the skinheads. It sounded like it had some similarities to what we think of as skinheads, the sort of neo-Nazism. That's that kind of stuff here in the U.S. I'm not sure if it was exactly the same sort of stuff going on in Britain. I just don't know much about this. Really, I don't necessarily want to study it. But anyway, he talks about them, the skinhead group, and he says there's no guarantee of the intrinsically progressive or regressive nature of particular cultural forms. So you think skinheads, and I guess you think, wow, what could be more regressive than something like that, right? But then he points out that there was this rock against racism movement period of this, and as an alternative cultural practice, and it articulated the elements of this. And suddenly, I guess the same group became anti-racist. So anti-racism became a fashionable thing that could be made explicit. So I thought this was interesting on 197, how he says this rock against racism movement was basically a way that the left inserted itself into a language which was capable of being heard. So I think that line's worth fixating on a little bit here. So the left inserted itself into a language which was capable of being heard. So that seemed like a pretty profound insight to me. I love the way that's worded. And then he gives a hilarious example later on, but I put it here. So he says it would have been pretty stupid, right, if instead of having this rock against racism music and I guess all that, if you just had these politicians come on in the middle of a Clash concert and just start giving a traditional political speech, they would have been, I'm sure, booed off the stage. So that would have been a kind of what's the word? I guess a very crude approach or not sensitive at all to the culture of this cultural form, but instead trying to find a language into which you could insert your message and have it actually be heard. So the impression I get from this section is this, if Hall was writing about rhetoric, here's where he would say, this is how rhetoric should work. Rhetoric should be, I guess, this process where we take our message and translate it, if you will, into a language which the group that we're targeting can actually hear it. Okay, so then he carries on a little bit with some of these other ideas, politics, and how it functions on the terrain of the popular. But the people and the popular are themselves constituted through discourses, collective practices, cultural forms. And he talks about Jamaican people, but I think you could just as easily think about the American people. Think about how many times you're watching the news or these talking heads, and one of them will say, well, I think the American people want blah, blah, blah. And you might say, well, I'm an American and I don't want that. And so I think if you can sort of get into that idea, you can sort of start to see where I think Hall is coming from with this idea of these terms and how they're contested and how there's different understandings of what it means to be the American people, and how a lot of this just has to do with discourse, but also collective practices, cultural forms, and all the stuff that goes with it. And he talks a little bit more about religion over on 197. He's got this line, there's nothing so residual as religion. And he's got his position on it. And some really beautiful passages, I thought. He's talking about the slaves, how slaves were using religion basically as a survival mechanism, right? This very harsh, extremely harsh scenario they found themselves in. Religion was, he says, 201, religion wasn't the opium of the oppressed so much as it was a means of survival. So that's some very strong stuff there. He says that really what happened was they adapted these forms in such a way that something is secured. So I love this line on page 200. So he says they needed a language to tell them who they were, but they only had one book, the Bible. So they made that say what they needed to hear it say. So yeah, it's just a fascinating idea. So they needed a language to tell them who they were, but they only had one book, the Bible. So they made that say what they needed to hear it say. So this statement, it seems to me that this statement has some implications for not only rhetoric, but also for literature. It just seems really profound to me. Every time I read it, I feel like I get a different insight. So I think it'd be a good place again to pause. What do you think about what he's saying here about the Bible and I guess the slaves and how they were using the Bible? What do you make of this passage? Okay, so then to move on, he talks about immigration, or immigrants rather, and I really thought this was an evocative line here. So the first generation of immigrants lives in a foreign territory, but the third generation has no other place to go. It has no other sense of itself than what is offered within that foreign territory. But in fact, it has developed another sense of itself, a sense of itself as other. And then he's got this, he tries to elaborate on this by talking about the young black people in Britain. So he says, on the one hand, they're kind of worse off in terms of economically and politically than their grandparents were. He says in one way they're better off. They have a better sense of themselves in the world. They have pride of their place. They have a capacity to resist. They know when they are being abused by the dominant culture, and they have begun to know how to hold it at bay. But above all, they have a sense of some other person that they really are. They have become visible to themselves. So I feel like I sort of get a gist of what Hall is talking about here. Still sort of struggling a little bit with it. So I want to see what you make of it here in a second. But it goes on to talk about this idea some more. So this is on page 205, and he says people have to have a language to speak about where they are and what other possible futures are available to them. So he was talking there about, I think it was what, Rastafarianism, if I'm not, if I haven't forgotten already, but he was saying, I guess, that they had some lore, if you will, within that about Ethiopia, and was it one of the great leaders, I suppose, in history of Ethiopia. And he said that I guess as history or archaeology or whatever it was, they were coming out with some new discoveries about Ethiopian history, and it sort of portrayed a very negative view. So they I guess they were sort of holding up this Ethiopian history. It's kind of an idyllic place, and the history coming out and the archaeology was basically saying, it wasn't such a great place, pretty terrible place. And so that was sort of contradicting, I suppose, their lore about Ethiopia. And so he talks about that, but then he says, look, these futures may not be real. May or may not be. It doesn't really matter. It almost seems like what is real is the possibility of being someone else, of being in some other social space from the one which you have already been placed. So I think I sort of see where what Hall is getting at here, but I think I could use your help. I'd like to get your interpretation of these ideas that Hall is talking about here. This line on page 205: people have to have a language to speak about where they are and what other possible futures are available to them. And again, how do you interpret this? What do you think Hall is saying? And do you agree or disagree with it? Okay, then just to wrap this up, and I guess the book as well, this is another great line on page 206, and he says, rather than reserving the notion of class struggle only for the moment of the barricades, we need to see resistance as the continual practices of working on the cultural domain and opening up cultural possibilities. So I think, this is what, 1983? I swear he could have written this today. I think we still tend to do this, right? We think about class struggle, and it's always in the context of a protest that's going on right now, or a big protest yesterday. It's like we're not even thinking about anything but these events that get on the news, and we sort of think of that as being the struggle. Whereas I think Hall wants to take a broader, sort of, it's like sort of back up a little bit, see the bigger picture, sort of see this as a continual practice of working on this cultural domain, opening up these possibilities. So he says the conditions within which people are able to construct subjective possibilities as well as new political subjectivities for themselves are not simply given in the dominant system. They are one in the practices of articulation which produce them. So a great wrap up here. I think that brings Hall's thought together in a nice package there. All right, so I guess we're done with Stuart Hall. Hopefully you enjoyed the book. I'll leave it off here. I would like to just get your general thoughts on the book, whether you thought it was valuable or not, or what you think the key takeaways were for you. But anyway, I'll leave it off here, and hope you're having a good day.